Awesome.
All right, and we are live. Welcome to the first ever Charlie Horse Radio formal debate, which is pretty cool. We've never done this before. We're gonna give it a shot. I'm Jason. I'm gonna be your moderator today, and our debaters we have John Son of Dick and Nurgle Jones. They're going to debate the prompt: Was slavery the primary cause of Southern secession? Um, so I guess before we get into it, we'll just give people a few minutes to filter in if they want to watch it live. How we'll do the debate is we'll have 5 minute openers for each of you guys. Then we'll do open dialogue for like an hour or so, and then we'll finish it off with 5 minute closers, and then we'll check the live chat. I'll remind people periodically to put their questions in the live chat if they have any, and after the closers at the end, we'll take a few minutes and go through those if there are any, and hopefully we'll keep the whole thing under 2 hours. I know Nurgle, you're like 6 hours ahead of us in time zones or something, so we don't want to keep you up super late. But but yeah, thank you for thanks for agreeing to this. I see John challenging people to debates all the time on Substack, and Nurgle, you're the first one who's actually accepted it, so that's pretty cool. So thanks for coming on.
I mean, I appreciate it. I appreciate you wanting to debate. I'd say it is pretty cool, but honestly, it's kind of more lame. People wouldn't actually debate. I think open dialogue's pretty cool, to be frank with you.
Yeah.
Yeah, especially way better than arguing in the comment sections over.
Yeah.
Honestly, that's kind of pointless. It's almost like, would you want to basically argue with somebody in a room for 6 or 7 hours through comments? No, not really. It's frustrating. It's annoying. Live debates, an hour or two. It's much better in my opinion.
Yeah, for sure. So, do you guys want to, while we kind of wait for people to filter in, do you guys want to both introduce yourselves real quick? Whoever wants can go first.
Yeah, go ahead, Nurgle.
Yeah, sure. So as far as it goes, Nurgle Jones is a pseudonym. My real name, I don't usually give out that often. I am a Creole, essentially. Right now, I'm currently living in the EU in Portugal. I've lived in a few countries. I'm originally from Florida. Spent the first 12 years of my life down in the South, essentially. I will say that I do love my state. I love Florida. I love the culture down there. In fact, not to sound too biased, but I actually do think Southern culture is, for a myriad of reasons, it's my favorite culture. I think it's superior in a lot of ways. Spent some time living in Canada as well, another decade or so. I've lived across the world, Korea, Spain, and now I'm in Portugal. Overall, the null files, I try to publish things that are unusual, uncommon, and really right now it's a lot of internet ethnography. But I'm trying to stay away from the politics overall, just things that I find strange, interesting, or old school, basically. Used to work on music a long time ago, but for an intro, I'll leave it at that, basically.
Cool. John, you want to introduce yourself? People probably already know you on our podcast, but you can do it anyway if you want.
John, Son of Dick. I write at Bright Sunny South, and predominantly Southern history, Southern culture, a lot of Jefferson posting. I too am a Floridian on my mom's side, 7th generation. I'm living in Southeast Georgia now, and I've never lived anywhere other than the South. San Antonio is the furthest I've ever gotten away from the deep South. So, yeah.
No kidding. Southeast, so I'm guessing Savannah or near there, essentially?
Waycross, so all the way, we're less than an hour from the Florida border.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Cool.
So I guess we can go ahead and get into it then. We got a few people in the live chat. We might get more, hopefully. But so for people listening in the live chat, I'll remind you about this periodically throughout the debate. But you can. So the way, I guess I haven't told the listeners this, but the way this will work is the format will be 5 minute openers for each side. Nurgle's going to be taking the affirmative that yes, slavery was the primary cause for Southern secession. John is going to be taking the negative. We're going to have 5 minute openers for each side, about an hour or so of open dialogue. I won't be too strict about that. I won't cut you off in the middle of a exchange or something. and then we'll do 5-minute closers at the end. And then after that, we'll do questions from the live chat if we have any. So with that, we'll go ahead and get into the openers. So Nurgle, since you have the affirmative, you want to go ahead and go first?
Yeah, I'd love to. I'll
cool. So
be a bit. So yeah.
So I'll put 5 minutes on the clock, and
oh gosh,
I'll start the clock when you start talking, and I'll give you a heads up when you got 30 seconds left. Does that sound good?
Sounds good, more or less. I'm gonna try and be a bit funny just to keep it fresh, but yeah, it sounds good.
All right, whenever you're ready, go for it.
All right. So I am here today to talk about WOG. Now, what is WOG? WOG is Uyghur Occupied Government Syndrome. That's right, we are a nation controlled by Uyghurs, or at the very least, the descendants of Uyghur ideology. Now, when I say Uyghur, I actually mean Whig, as in the Whig Party. The Whig is shifty, the Whig is slippery, the Whig is neither here nor there, neither hot nor cold, neither Jacksonian nor Jeffersonian, but somehow always standing in the doorway trying to find the common ground within the nation. The Whig says, "Gentlemen, surely this is a matter upon which reasonable men may find common ground." Common ground? Common ground on slavery? The Whig has not been able to find the middle ground between human bondage and, well, the wish to abolish slavery. The Whig wants things to be neutral. The Whig wants the country to remain the same. The Whig wants to discuss tariffs. This is unfortunate for the Whig because slavery divided the Whig Party and essentially eliminated this party system in the US. The slave question, I would argue, is the biggest issue of the antebellum period in the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, and of course with the culmination of the Civil War. It's what ended the Whig Party. It's what divided the nation prior to the Civil War. And my opponent, John, may bring up other issues for Southern secession, but I think it is the primary one. To add to this argument, essentially, there are numerous cases where politicians do reference slavery as the primary cause of the conflict. It's there for the rise of the Republican Party. Abraham Lincoln quotes slavery as the cause directly numerous times. You have different Southern declarations of secession that do reference slavery explicitly. If there are other arguments about tariffs, about states' rights, ultimately, my question is states' rights for what, essentially? My concern is that while there are other issues, slavery is really the defining factor that could not be solved and did result in both secession and ultimately the Civil War.
Are you good? Are you good with that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
You still got a couple minutes left. I'm just making sure.
Yeah, I definitely am. Yeah.
All right, cool. We'll call it there then. And so, yeah, to remind the listeners, drop any questions in the live chat. I'll just keep reminding you of this every time there's a break. So, and we'll get to those at the end. So, we'll go into the next opener now. So, John, I'll put 5 minutes on the clock for you, and I'll give you a heads up at 30 seconds left. So, whenever you're ready, go for it.
All right. So, first, allow me to remind those listening for the prompt of this debate, which is slavery was the primary cause of Southern secession. My opponent, Nurgle, is of course arguing that it was, and I am arguing that it was not. I would like to further note that slavery was not a cause of secession, is not the position I'm arguing for. I fully accept that slavery was a factor considered in the Southern secession movement beginning in late 1860 and continuing through early 1861. It is my contention that slavery was not the primary cause, and there were other more pressing and universally proclaimed grievances which caused the secession of the 11 Southern states which formed the Confederate States of America. There's ample evidence to support this claim, but before I can discuss that, I must outline what Southern secession was exactly. It was at first not a monolithic movement. It was a somewhat disorganized and staggered seceding of 11 states, the first 7 of whom unified under the Constitution of the Confederate States on March 11, 1861. The others joined as they seceded. To put the rapidity of this timeline into context, South Carolina, the first to secede, did so on December 20th, 1860. with the first battle of the war, the Battle of Fort Sumter, kicking off April 12, 1861. By this point, only South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas had seceded, while Virginia led the post-First Battle wave of secession on April 17, 1861, with Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee following in order until June 8th. The lack of an initial monolithic movement and the short time which passed between South Carolina seceding and the start of the war makes it difficult to understand precisely what was going on in the single mind of the Confederate States of America. In fact, there was no single mind until the second wave of secession brought the Confederacy to its full strength. And here I must remind the listener again that this debate is not about the motives of any single state, but of the Confederacy as a whole movement. If we are to assume that slavery was the primary cause for this movement, we can rightly assume that a concession on slavery by the United States government would have resulted in either an immediate pause to the movement and a return to peace, or a significant slowing down to give everyone involved time to breathe and discuss the issue of slavery. In fact, we do see exactly this concession on slavery in the form of an amendment proposed in 1860 and discussed with fervor until the Battle of Fort Sumter. This amendment was proposed by Thomas Corwin, an Ohio representative, and was endorsed by outgoing President Buchanan and incoming President Lincoln. It would have effectively cemented slavery as a constitutionally protected right and perpetually prevented the federal government from interfering with the institution, including the forbidding of compensated emancipations. In other words, the institution of slavery was proposed to be a fundamental right of the states and was accepted by the emancipator himself to stop the bleeding of secession. It obviously did not work, and it is damning that Virginia herself ratified the amendment before seceding due to grievances which were obviously other than and more primary to her interest in slavery. In addition to Virginia, Kentucky, Ohio, Rhode Island, Maryland, and Illinois also ratified the amendment, which had passed both houses with a two-thirds majority. While slavery was a factor in secession, it was not the primary factor. In fact, secession was an inevitable outcome of the voluntary nature of the Union, which was intended to protect individual states and regions from being oppressed, subjugated, or otherwise ill-served by any others. When to this voluntary nature of the Union was added pressure such as protective tariffs, which harmed one side and benefited the other, vastly different economic systems between the North and South, and a never-ending battle for dominance in the federal government by way of territory expansion, Southern secession was, to the honest observer, a logical conclusion, and one that was not unprecedented in American history. While the causes of secession were numerous, I do not need to prove why precisely the South did secede. I merely have the burden to prove that they did not secede primarily due to an ideological conflict between pro-slavery Southerners and abolitionist Northerners. And the fact that there were both slavers and abolitionists in the North and South during the war should be sufficient evidence of that.
Well said.
All right, is that it?
Yeah, that's it.
Cool. All right. With that, I will remind the listeners, if you have any questions for either debater at any point, drop those in the live chat, and we'll get to those at the very end. And we'll go into the open dialogue section now. So we'll go for about an hour. Like I said before, I won't be too strict about it. Like I won't cut you guys off in the middle of an exchange or anything. But we'll just try to keep it about 2 hours because I know Nurgle, it's late for you, so we won't keep. We'll try not to keep you up too far past midnight. So
sure, I appreciate that.
So with that, I'll start the clock now, and you guys can go at it for open dialogue.
Awesome.
Okay.
Do you want to start?
I want to cue in on a few things.
Yeah,
absolutely. So you mentioned how tariffs would have harmed one side specifically, essentially, and you listed this as potentially one of the causes or grievances of the Civil War, correct?
Yes.
By that, you're referring to the moral tariff, yeah?
Yeah, so this goes back even prior to the war. So, of course, obviously we have the tariff abomination, which caused a nullification crisis, right? So that's kind of one of the precedents that are set that Southern states were willing to secede over tariff issues. But then the moral tariff, which would have been a 70% tax on all imports in the first year and a 38 to 45% tax in later years. That was very, very crippling to the Southern economy and heavily influenced the secession cause.
I would partially agree in a sense, but saying that, it was passed in 1861, if I'm not mistaken. It was passed basically right at the end of the secession. I would say it's about 6 months into it, essentially. The moral tariff, I would argue, would not have passed had the southern states remained in the Union, essentially. Because they left, that's what allowed it to be passed. You have basically all these states leaving the Union. What happens in the North? They want to pass the tariff. Without states like South Carolina, Alabama, Florida, et cetera, able to vote, it passed. Had they stayed in the Union, the tariff would have never passed, basically. And in fact, it only passed basically at the end of the secession crisis and the start of the Civil War.
Um,
In addition to that, I should also say, tariffs were at from what I'm aware of, a 70-year low, essentially. There weren't really tariffs or any major taxations as far as I'm aware of, especially compared to Britain and other countries. I know the UK likes
Right.
to reference the moral tariff, essentially, but this is going to sound conspiratorial. That seems more like British propaganda. So, of course, the Brits had diplomatic relations with the Confederate States of America. You also have a major abolitionist movement there. I know South Carolina, it's not in the secession, but they do have a declaration saying, all you remaining states who have not signed on with the Confederacy, look what the North is doing. They're about to basically add tariffs to you, essentially. Don't you want to join? Maybe that sort of influenced Virginia, for example. Maybe they were trying to pull Delaware, other states as well, but it was way late into the game at that point. And then whenever it's brought up as a talking point, it's usually the British bringing it up with their periodicals. You even have John Stuart Mill mentioned in tariffs. You have Karl Marx, of all people, mentioning the tariffs, how it's sort of British magazine propaganda to try and galvanize the British public to support in the South, to try and distract them from the issue of slavery. But from what I'm aware of, the tariffs, they weren't really a factor. They were pretty much low, and the moral tariff only passed because the southern states had already seceded, basically. Had they stayed, wouldn't have mattered.
There were still the moral tariffs was passed prior to the Battle of Fort Sumter, which meant that
I think about a month before, maybe. But you still had like months and months of debate, deliberation, and the states were out. Basically, they could have rejoined, voted against it. It wouldn't have passed. If, in fact, because they were out, you had just the northern states. That's why it passed, to be frank.
Okay. So on talking about tariffs, I think it's a really good way to get to the heart of the grievances between the North and South.
Oh yeah.
In their different economic systems fundamentally, and this is one of the reasons that so the agrarian economy necessitated that obviously they had free trade, or at least a much freer trade, because they weren't producing finished products. And this is what obviously caused the nullification crisis, but regardless of whether or not the moral tariffs would have passed had the South not seceded, the fundamental understanding of the Constitution and the first Confederacy of the colonies was that once the national government ceased to benefit a party, they had the right to remove themselves from that. And the economic systems continued to get further and further apart. The North continued to industrialize, and the South continued to become deeper and more entrenched in their agrarianism. And that is, regardless if the moral tariffs would have passed, that would have been a issue that continually kept on rearing its head.
I definitely agree. I would say the North definitely was more industrialized than the South. But saying that, I'll be a bit controversial. I think the moral tariffs were generally a good idea. It really upset the British and the Germans more because essentially the North wanted the South and other northern states, especially in the not the Rust Belt, but Illinois, et cetera, to rely more on American manufacturing. They wanted to become less reliant upon European manufacturing, so they created the tariff to essentially support their own domestic industries. Either way, what I would say is that regardless, what essentially happened is the southern states seceded, and then after that, the moral tariff was proposed. Hey, you know what? All the Southerners are gone. Mm-hmm. Let's do tariffs now. Great idea. Why not? Not
Now
all, but
the
obviously the states that initially started, and then obviously Virginia's still there, but you get what I'm saying.
Yeah, but the moral tariff was proposed. So the Republican Party was formed in 1857.
1855. Oh, actually, yeah, I think you're right. The Whig Party ended in 1855, 1857. Yeah, approximately.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
and the tariff began to be proposed in 1857, and that was proposed at that 30-ish%, which the South threatened to secede over, and then it was raised to 70%.
Yeah, yeah, but again, I would say it wouldn't have passed had the South stayed. Essentially, it's something where the South could have easily nullified. It's sort of like imagine if the Democrats today decided to pass a bill forcing abortion in every state. It's like, we're going to secede. You don't have to. You can just basically vote against it. There's a lot of radical and crazy bills proposed. Basically, that's what I mean to say.
Yeah, but so the idea that the South could have just stayed and voted against it,
They could have.
sure, they could have tried.
They would have won.
But once okay, so in my opening statement, I talked a bit about the competition for power in the federal government through territory expansion.
Yep,
and
that's a big
so
issue. I want to talk about too, actually.
Yeah, and so this is all hypothetical, but even if the South could have prevented the moral tariffs from passing at that time,
maybe 20 years down the line, basically, they might have not been able to do anything about it.
Perhaps, but I mean the free, but even immediately, the Kansas was becoming a free state. Nebraska was a free state. So you have this consistent expansion that is leaning heavily towards the northeastern support.
Saying that, Nebraska, Kansas, Illinois, they weren't really in favor of the moral tariff either, to be frank with you. And you actually mentioned free states as well. Kansas is a free state, Nebraska is a free state. But for me, the issue basically is maybe 20 years down the line, the South may have been pigeonholed into a situation where the tariff was passed, but at the time, they weren't. I'll also get to the agrarian nature as well, if you don't mind.
Yeah, go ahead.
So the South was agrarian. The plantation system was basically king. Cotton was king, to be frank. It supplied the world with cotton. My own family, I'm Creole. My own family used to have a plantation, for example. I've got both the blood of the enslaved and slavers, blah, 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 etc. Railways. How valuable do you think the railways were? Just a guesstimate or estimate.
Like across all the territories, or just in the South?
Just across the entire territories at the time of 1860. It's about $2 billion.
Yeah, they were certainly beneficial. I mean, once you get into like the railways that are being built in like Western territories, it kind of is a little bit less. But yeah.
If you look at the South, the Southern economy, what value do you think it had?
It was significant. I don't have the exact number.
It's about $3 billion from what I'm aware of. The South was agrarian, but it wasn't really poor. It was just deindustrialized.
Correct.
So another argument that often comes up is essentially the agrarian South versus the industrialized North. I'll do a bit of a left brain argument. You also mentioned that there were slavers in the Union, in the South. There were abolitionists, lots of different views. We often hear about the radical Republican view against slavery. It's a moral crusade. It certainly is. Another viewpoint that was against slavery expanding westward was actually almost proto-socialist. Sounds weird, but a lot of the Republican Party was split among the issue of this is a moral crusade versus this is an economic crusade.
Yes.
There was the wish to basically dispossess the new territories of slavery because, simply put, the white man, because there were a lot of racists in the North as well, wouldn't be able to compete with slave labor in the new territories, essentially. A Southern magnate could simply open up shop, open a plantation here or there, and that's it. I don't want to sound too racist, but a modern day analogy may be, okay, so we have to compete with thousands of imported people from Latin America or India. We can't find jobs in the West, etc. But what I'm trying to illustrate is that the Southern economy, while it was agrarian, it wasn't necessarily a pauper's game. It wasn't necessarily a poor economy. You're right about the tariffs potentially harming them, but my argument here is that A, the tariffs wouldn't have been passed if the South had remained, and B, even past that, there's a lot of talk decrying the industrial North essentially, but the South wasn't that much better, even if you ignore the moral aspects of slavery. It's cheap labor for basically nothing, essentially. It had to end, to be frank.
So, of course, the North was famously importing Irish, essentially slaves, and working for pennies on the dollar in
I'll disagree with
factories.
that. Not slaves. You can pay an Irishman a lot more than a slave, essentially. And a lot of the arguments were we cannot compete in the West. We cannot compete with slaves. Slaves are not paid.
So this is Lysander Spooner would disagree with this when he wrote No Treason, and he talked about the moral crusade of slavery, and he basically said that's a non-factor in the war because, of course, slavery is not defined as only chattel slavery, but it's also defined properly in the American context. Slavery is defined as the ownership of one's economic production.
I agree. We have wage slavery, for example, but wage slavery and
Sure.
chattel slavery, I wouldn't compare the two. It's in economics, it's you don't pay one group and you pay another group pennies on the dollar, but it's still a lot of the West would have probably been not as developed as it was, in my opinion. In that sense, as far as it goes, I don't think slavery had long to go in the U.S. Even then, it was very virulently defended in the South. But to illustrate the point, I wouldn't consider the South is agrarian, but I wouldn't consider them poor, basically.
No, and I agree with you. They weren't poor. Their capital was in hard land and hard goods rather than
Oh yeah.
money. Which does, obviously but the agrarian nature of producing goods or producing raw goods makes the tariffs much more detrimental to Southern economy than it does the Northern economy.
But they wouldn't have been passed. And on top of that, with the tariffs, like it or not, it did help the U.S. in the end. The U.S. stopped relying on the British for imported industrial goods. They started producing more goods in New England. Obviously, it favors New England as a whole, but it's sort of
Mm-hmm.
like how some countries may basically stop tariffs, or not stop tariffs, stop imported goods from, I don't know, China to help develop their domestic industries, like Donald Trump, for example. But either way, wouldn't have been passed had the South remained.
Um, when you said that it benefited the United States as a whole,
I would agree, yes.
yeah. So here I would push back a little bit that the Southern conception of the United States was vastly different from the New England conception of the United States. They didn't understand that the United States were being benefited as a whole, and it was the Southern states weren't willing to sacrifice on behalf of the United States as an abstract concept. They were, Jefferson Davis knew personally John C. Calhoun. They were deeply dedicated to the idea that every state was essentially a sovereign nation. And so they wouldn't have been willing to sacrifice for New England moneymen to get richer.
I could agree in part. I'll actually push back a little bit as well. I would say Robert E. Lee, he was definitely somebody who loved the Union, loved the United States. It wasn't until the last moment, essentially, that he wound up fighting for Virginia, of course. I would say George Washington was his hero. He loved the Union. But saying that, I would say that it did benefit the U.S. in the end. Had the U.S. not actually industrialized, we may be looking at a different picture where the U.S. is akin to South Africa, the Boers, other countries where they simply continue to rely upon British manufacturing and they developed no domestic industries. But regardless, I think I've actually kind of detracted a little bit. Essentially, slavery, the issue over slavery, tariffs, the moral tariff, 1861. It was something that only passed because the South seceded. Had the South remained, it wouldn't have passed. And before that, there's basically a 70-year low on tariffs, honestly. Even past that, I do know different states like South Carolina like to cite tariffs, but that was really towards the end of it. Look, if you guys stay in the Union, you're gonna be tariffed, and it's sort of like, yeah, but if you had stayed yourself, you could have prevented this. I don't think tariffs are a big issue, basically.
Okay, so to kind of shift gears from tariffs a bit, you mentioned the declarations of each of the states for their immediate cause of secession.
I did, yes.
Yeah. So, of course, all of the states, they do cite slavery as a cause.
I'd say pretty commonly. In fact, if you basically, I don't want to say I did control F. If you look at all the different mentions of slavery, it's slavery, slavery, slavery. If you get to, for example, trying to think, it's the vice president. I can't recall his name. Vice president of the Confederate States of America. He says,
Stevens.
yeah, Stevens. That's it. Basically, he says that basically, our great nation, the backbone is slavery. It's pretty common, to be frank.
Yeah, and of course, Stevens was a Georgian. Georgia was one of the states, along with Mississippi, that was very, very strong on slavery being a cause of secession.
Oh yeah.
But out of the 13 states, only 4 that seceded said that slavery was a cause. And then of those 4, only 2 of them, which would have been Georgia and Mississippi, said that slavery was
The primary cause.
the primary cause. And then the other 2, Texas, South Carolina, said that slavery was the latest in a long line of abuses. So
Oh,
they didn't cite it as being a primary cause.
no, to be fair, South Carolina, they constantly cried wolf in the 1830s, 1850s. They threatened to secede. If I recall correctly, they also threatened to secede if Lincoln was elected. And
Um,
that's kind of indicative of like Lincoln, he's going to end slavery. We're going to leave.
well, they
Yeah.
wouldn't have had any real substantial. If we're going to say that South Carolina cried wolf, and we're going to make those assumptions, then we can also make the assumption that when Lincoln would kind of tip his hat to the idea of abolition prior to his election, that he was also crying wolf, that he was not being completely honest. And we know that for sure by the fact that he upheld slavery in the states that did not secede through the Emancipation Proclamation, and he even said that he would have been willing to keep slavery if it meant that the states didn't secede. He cited his primary cause for the war, which was to maintain the Union. A house divided against itself cannot stand.
It's a complicated issue, Lincoln. I'd say this is probably the weakest point I have, maybe, but saying that, allow me to try and elaborate a little bit. So for the South, he did promise that if the Southern states stayed, he would enshrine, just to paraphrase, enshrine slavery within the Constitution and
Yeah.
ensure that they would never have it removed.
Yes.
Saying that, he did highlight that he would not be doing that in the free territories, essentially. That was a huge issue. The free territories would be open to that anti-slavery crusade. So as you say, essentially, sooner or
Mhm.
later, the South will be outnumbered by that.
Sure.
Saying that wasn't good enough for the South. And again, this is over the issue of slavery. He's basically saying, if I do this to enshrine slavery, will you stay? No, it's too late. We don't trust you. And also, you're going to basically prevent it in the Western territories. It's still over the issue of slavery, and on the issue of him enshrining it within the Constitution. In that regard, I would say Lincoln was a pragmatist. He essentially saw preserving the Union as the greatest good here, something he
Mhm.
could basically bank on. He didn't want the Union to dissolve, but saying that, pragmatism does not necessarily mean that he doesn't have his own ambitions, own beliefs, own strongly religiously influenced beliefs. He wanted to end slavery. He thought it was an evil. Maybe he would have figured out some way to do it eventually, but it's politics. Trying to keep the South in. That's what it was basically.
So on the topic of Lincoln being influenced by his deep rooted religious beliefs, Lincoln was if he was any kind of Christian, it was for the pragmatic benefit that the president of the United States had to be Christian. He wrote a treatise defending. Well, he wrote a treatise defending adultery, defending that was okay. And when you look at people that actually knew Lincoln, like Bledsoe, people like this, they write about Lincoln being really just a truly horrendous human being as far as his morals go.
Okay.
Lincoln was dedicated famously, he was dedicated to the pursuit of power. Being president was all that Lincoln ever wanted his entire life. And he didn't care how he got there, whether it meant siding with the Jacobins or being a Democrat. He didn't care as long as he got in the Oval Office. And we we see that Lincoln didn't actually care about, again, the Emancipation Proclamation, which did not free slaves in the states that Lincoln actually had jurisdiction in. The Constitution couldn't apply to states outside of the states that were a part of the United States. Once the Confederacy seceded, they severed that contract with the United States of America. The Emancipation Proclamation had no authority over those states, no legal authority. It was purely a posturing to gain public support.
I would say it had authority, but only in federal land, essentially. And what is federal land? Any land that's currently in rebellion. I'll disagree on
any land that was occupied by federal forces. The Emancipation Proclamation wasn't in effect in.
Occupied by federal forces, as in the army was in.
Correct. Yeah. So, but the United States government did not own South Carolina or Georgia once they seceded. They became a separate country.
I would disagree on that one, essentially, but that's more a legalistic argument. But as far as it goes, he couldn't declare slavery void in the states that remained in the Union. These still had individual states' rights. As far as it goes, he could basically declare territories in rebellion under federal control. So in that sense, Emancipation Proclamation applied to the South. I'll disagree on the moral character of Lincoln. I think he was fantastic. I think he was a good man overall. But what I would say is, imagine you're a Southern senator. Lincoln is elected. You see him as somebody who defends adultery, horrible, without morals, etc. Then he says, hey, you know what? No slavery in the Western territories, but I promise you can keep it in the South or whatever. What do? You don't believe him. South Carolina, again, threatened to secede multiple times, and especially if Lincoln was elected, because they thought he would basically end slavery one way or another. I would argue that that's still the big issue over here, essentially.
What do you have any references from? Is it only analyzing South Carolina, like a type of psychoanalysis, South Carolina, to say that they threatened to secede because Lincoln would emancipate the slaves? Or is there actual documentation that if Lincoln got elected, he would emancipate slaves, therefore that was the cause for South Carolina secession?
And South Carolina seemed to think Lincoln would emancipate the slaves. To be fair, he was definitely very anti-slavery as far as it goes. The radical side of the Republican Party was. They assumed he would go for it, basically.
Yeah. So on the topic of the emancipation of slavery, Virginia was the state that had emancipated the most amount of slaves of any state in the Union, and that was prior to 1860. So and Georgia was the first state in its organic constitution to outlaw the importation of slaves.
I should say southern states, though, essentially. The northern states didn't have slavery at that point, essentially. Virginia, the state with the most emancipated slaves. The northern states didn't have it at that point.
Well, the northern states never really engaged in slavery as much as the southern states did. And of course, a lot of that can be boiled down to the fact that one was an agrarian, the other was an industrial economy. But the North were the ones participating in the slave trade. They were the ones bringing slaves to the United States, even after it was illegal internationally. They would bring slaves, they would sell them south. And the southern states, they were actively trying to emancipate slaves. The issue...
I don't know about that.
Well, the linchpin became then, well, what do you do with a massive population of uneducated slaves once they're emancipated? And that was the issue that all of the founding fathers dealt with, right? Thomas Jefferson writes about this. He's like, we can't just emancipate them.
It's a tough one.
It is a tough one. And Virginia had been actively working on it. They'd been educating slaves. They had been trying, and they had been successful in emancipating over 100,000 slaves.
It's also the industrial heartland of the South. I think about 40% of the industry is there. It's there's a reason why they emancipated slaves, because Virginia was also industrializing as well.
Yes, and that's true. There are other factors in it. But when you actually read like the sources on this, Robert Louis Dabney, for example, that he talks about all of this, and he doesn't really cite the industrializing of Virginia as being a cause of it. He cites it as being essentially a moral crusade as well, too, because the Southern Christians didn't think that slavery was ideal. The issue then became, where we have these slaves, what do we do with them? That became the question. And so it would have been ideal to have no slaves to begin with. That was like part of the complaints in the Declaration of Independence, and going back to...
You don't want Haiti, basically.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So that kind of became the issue, but they the Christianity of the South did not necessarily believe that slavery was a moral good. They believed that it was a moral good relative to having a Haitian revolution.
Okay. So I'll give you this. My ancestors, the Haitians tried to kill them. Basically, they killed all the, I would say, all the plantation owners. They killed all the whites. They killed all the Creoles. At least as much as they could do so. Essentially, I'm not a fan
Yeah.
of the revolution there. But this is still over the issue of slavery. Essentially, it's simply gone from a moral issue to essentially, you know what, this isn't good, but we don't want a slave revolt. Saying that, I would say there were definitely movements in the South, mostly in the North, though. I disagree there that the South was better than the North. I would say movements trying to return slaves to Africa. Of course, you have Liberia, within the British Empire, Sierra Leone. But I don't think that, as far as it goes, the fear of a slave revolt was necessarily well founded. I mean, there was, of course, Nat Turner's rebellion. There
Yeah.
was, of course, John Brown. But saying that, I think had a slave revolt been a major issue, it would have surfaced during Reconstruction, to be frank. And for Reconstruction, there was violence, of course, but Union troops, I believe it's about 10,000 in the South in total. Things were pretty well. I almost hate to say it because I'm part black, but things are pretty well under control. They could have handled Reconstruction, the emancipation of slavery, pretty well, honestly. They chose not to. I think they chose not to because they saw it as an economic benefit. Again, that $3 billion industry, and because morally they just didn't see it as horrendous as the North did. Especially the Quakers and the radical Republicans, they hated it. John Brown was the one to kill for it. That's a difference. It's like the South. If you kill someone in the South over slavery, it's insane. It's horrible. In the North, John Brown was a hero. You can't basically argue the South saw slavery as something worse than the North did. The North hated slavery.
They did. That is true. A lot of them did. More. So I would vehemently disagree that Reconstruction was handled well, and if there was any semblance of order, it was because of the presence of the Klan. But that's kind of outside the scope of this. But
that's fair.
On the topic of whether or not the South wasn't only afraid of what would happen if blacks were emancipated. There was also a fundamental hatred, not only of slavers, but of Southern people, of Northern politicians. So, for example, William Parson Brownlow, who was set up as the governor of Tennessee post-war during Reconstruction. He said, quote, "If I had the power, I would arm every wolf, panther, catamount, and bear in the mountains of America, every crocodile in the swamps of Florida, every Negro in the South, every devil in hell, clothe them in the uniform of the federal army, and turn them loose on the rebels of the South and exterminate every man, woman, and child south of Mason and Dixon's line. I would like to see Negro troops under Ben Butler crowd every rebel into the Gulf of Mexico and drown them as the devil did the hogs in the Sea of Galilee."
Oh, yeah.
And then he said later, "I'm one of those who believe the war ended too soon. We've whipped the South, but not enough." So the point here being that the South was keenly aware that the North hated them. Northern politicians despised them. They were fundamentally different people.
So did the South, in the sense of Stonewall Jackson famously. I know people talk about the North committing war crimes, but Stonewall Jackson wanted a total war. He wanted to burn the North as well, to be frank with you.
So
the hatred was pretty
I
mutual.
actually disagree with Stonewall, just for the record. Okay. I side much more with Jeff Davis and Robert E. Lee and their.
Oh yeah, but I mean to say the hatred. I mean to say the hatred was mutual. I mean, you can find radicals on both sides saying, "Let's burn the South, let's burn the North." It's like Jackson, Stonewall Jackson, huge general. He wanted scorched earth. He didn't get his wish. But it's not just the North that hated the South, and I would say the prime reason for it was slavery. Unlike any other institution, 1830s, 40s, 50s, the violence in the territories, it was all over slavery. That was the stark divider, to be frank, the stark moral divider, at the very least.
Yeah, so I would agree that there was a fundamental hatred between Southerners and Northerners. And I think that it predates slavery. I mean, if you accept like Albion Seed, the thesis in Albion Seed, or the immigration patterns in the United States, with the South being fundamentally Celtic in its culture and the North being
Mm,
fundamentally Anglo, you have decades and centuries of history between those two peoples. And then also with like the Cavalier dispersion versus the Roundhead
I
between
agree.
between the South and North, you have this kind of
It's almost
continual
almost
conflict.
like an ethnic feud that carries over from Europe, essentially.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah,
And
yeah. Be frank, Roundheads versus the Cavaliers. Exactly. Yeah.
but I would, if if we're going to go back like that far, I would then at that point say that, well, this conflict was it was an inevitable outcome of trying to form these two groups of people into one nation, right? And it worked for a while because you're still coming off the high of the Revolutionary War. Everybody's still kind of together. Oh yeah, we hate England. We're kind of this thing that's not England. But as that starts to wear off and culture starts to be created in the United States, and you start to have this ever widening chasm between the North and South, while slavery was a part of that, the issues are fundamental, and slavery is just a tertiary issue that wasn't irrelevant to the immediate causes, but it was not the primary cause. The
Oh,
way that all of this past history, this culture that just divided and slowly divided until they no longer saw union as being beneficial to them.
I'll disagree on that one. I would say that there was certainly hatred, disagreement, antagonism among the average person, essentially. But it's united we fall, united we stand, divided we fall, not united we fall.
Yeah.
But what I would say is that even so, you do have people from across the spectrum, across the North and the South, essentially. I would even say famous figures from the South who wanted to preserve the Union because they saw it in the favor of the people. Basically, we are one people, one large destiny. Henry Clay, for example, one of my favorite politicians. He helped found the Republican Party. I open this with sort of a humorous thing on the Whigs. Essentially, this is WOG, Whigger, occupied government. I just love the fact that Whig and Whigger, it just sounds similar, but there were certainly divisions, but at a political level, while they may be heated, the Union was important. Without that, essentially, and of course, there's divisions between Cavaliers and Roundheads, etc. But we united at one point, one time, because we saw it in our common interest. There are differences, but there weren't fundamental differences. It's more or less things got heated up over certain issues, and I think the biggest issue is slavery. You don't hear, well, actually, you do hear people crying about the Cavaliers and my Cavalier ancestors, but overall in politics, it's not about the Cavaliers. It's about slavery. I might say another interesting tangent basically is the state's right to secede, essentially. I know you mentioned basically the structure of the United States government, how
Mhm.
secession was sort of legal, enriched. I don't, not enriched, enshrined. I don't really believe so. It is, but not in the way the southern states seceded, essentially. You do have in 1869 in Texas versus White, for example, where the issue was finally settled. You could say that was bias, but their arguments were, and this ties into the ancient, I guess, origin of the United States, or at the very least, the inception of the country. The country predates the Constitution. People are a concept that predates the Constitution. Therefore, according to Texas versus White, essentially, any sort of secession could happen, but it would require a unanimous will of the people, which the Union interpreted as the will of the federal government. But there was a strong belief that we were still a united people. We had a shared destiny. It was strong enough that the Union was willing to basically go to war over it, and I would say fight tooth and nail to keep the South in and not acquiesce on the issue of slavery. Um,
Certainly. Yeah, and I agree with you to that point that the North was willing to fight over that, and they still conceived of the United States as having one destiny that necessitated them being united.
yeah,
But
even today you can secede, but it's kind of dumb. Maybe not dumb, but you require the federal government to approve, which is basically a way of saying you can't really secede. But that's what the
right,
argument was. These states are
yeah,
in rebellion, technically, not a sovereign nation.
right. But that was not the way that the Constitution was understood in the era of the founding fathers, and then prior to 1860.
I'd push in that because the North interpreted it that way pretty well, to be honest, and they actually fought over that basically.
Well, but this, Massachusetts, New York, there were other threats to secede. The War of 1812, Mexican American
Yep.
War, bringing Texas into the Union. The North threatened to secede over these issues. So I don't think that there was this vast difference in the way they interpreted the right of the states to secede.
The Supreme Court seemed to do so. The politicians seemed to do so. You're right. New England threatened to secede over the War of 1812. You could argue it threatened to secede over federal overreach, tariffs as well, but 1812. In the South's case, it was secession over slavery, essentially. But regardless, the federal government, the feds, they always viewed secession as a fringe thing, something to kind of worry about. But that states did not have the right, or had the right, but they needed approval of the people, and the people was the federal government, basically.
So why was Jefferson Davis not hung as a traitor?
It's a good one.
Because he wanted to be tried he wanted to be tried for treason because he was a constitutional law scholar, and his rise and fall is all about defending Southern secession, and he never highlights slavery as being a cause.
So vice president does, and a lot of the states do. You're right. He wasn't really tried. He wanted to take that to court. I'll say that Texas versus White solved that, but saying that's kind of a cop out, sort of not. To be honest with you, I'm not a huge expert on this, but my interpretation, my understanding, basically was the North was afraid they may potentially lose, maybe not, maybe so. From what I remember, the trial was supposed to take place in Virginia. They didn't want to scandalize it, and had they won, I can remember hearing talk about how Davis might be seen as a martyr. It might basically cause insurrection. Wow, you hung Davis. He made really good arguments. Or wow, you basically tried Davis, found him guilty of treason. They just North really just wanted to bring the South back in to restore that union. And to that effect, they didn't want to shake things up. They even basically allowed the South to have Jim Crow, for example. I hope that helps. Kind of a cop out, but 1869, Texas versus White, fearing that there may be issues with the trial. I believe the trial was supposed to be held in Virginia, former Confederate state, and on top of that, they just didn't want to bother with the drama. Essentially, they didn't want Southern insurrection. That was a huge issue.
Who was tried on the side of the South for treason and indicted and actually brought up on charges?
From what I remember, it was general amnesty, but I can't actually say. I don't actually know that one. I remember it's a general amnesty from what I recall, correct? Yeah.
Yeah, and I would push back there that the fact that they didn't try anybody for treason is an admission that the secession movement was legally vindicated. They couldn't try them. There was no legal ground to do it.
Well, Texas versus White is a legal ground. That's what the U.S. cites today, for example. For Jefferson Davis, again, they were afraid potentially of the outcome of the trial in Virginia. I would argue that Virginia could be very biased, and the fact that had they won, there might have been issues. There was still the fear of insurrection in the South, essentially, and that was a legitimate concern. But as far as it goes, the amnesty was basically, hey, you know what? We want you back in the Union. We're united together in a strong way. We've got Britain across the ocean. We've got rising Germany. We've got other countries to worry about. We need to get our stuff ready to go for the wide world. I think they were arguably right to do so. Reconstruction I have issues with over how it turned out, but saying that, the amnesty, I don't disagree with it. I consider it to be a heinous crime, but the way the Republicans basically wanted to grant amnesty to reunite the nation, I think it was the right move.
Okay, fair enough. Okay, let's see.
Yeah, but I would say for the right of secession, I wouldn't even argue about it from a legal perspective. I think legally it's something which was solved by Texas versus White. But saying that, secession has never been about legality. 1776, essentially. Do you think they had the right to legally secede from the British Empire? No,
Yes.
Frankly, no.
I do.
Oh, maybe, but I mean, I would argue they're subjects of the king, essentially the king and crown. Secession rebellion, it's illegal. It's not about the legal right. It's about the moral right. It's about Antigone. It's about basically, legal or not, our liberties are being infringed upon. Damn the legality. This is about the moral issue. And for
Well,
me,
the founding fathers would vehemently disagree when they cite all of the legal reasons they had to
I get
declare
it.
independence from the British Empire.
I get it. The British side is illegal, basically. But I would
Well,
say
only
it's
some of them
legal.
did. Only some of them did. Edmund Burke didn't. Many of the British politicians, they actually supported the American secession movement or the American Declaration of Independence.
That's fair. There are a lot, but I would still argue ultimately the British Empire saw it as an illegal rebellion, essentially. My point being that it's not about the legality; it's about the morality of the issue. And I would say the American Revolution was a moral good. Liberty was being impeded upon for the Civil War, the War of Northern Aggression, the War of Southern Secession. I don't see it as legally viable, but more importantly, I don't see it as morally viable. I see it as a defense of slavery, and in that regard, I don't think it's the same. I don't think it's justified, or wasn't justified, I should say.
Okay.
There's an issue of defending slavery and not slavery. There's an issue of rebelling for your liberty, whether it's legal or not, versus rebelling for slavery. For me, it's like I could see the American Revolution as being moral, but the Southern Secession, it seems like a rebellion that's both legally unviable and also morally tenable at best. It's not really something I would support.
Yeah, but when we get down to the actual issue as it happened historically, the legality of it does matter immensely because it affects the way that the Southerners conceived of their own movement.
Oh yeah, but saying that, like, legally, Texas versus White, that was the resolution. You don't have the right to secede. I'm going to paraphrase it horribly. I'm not a lawyer, but basically, you need the will of the people, the government, the federal approval, blah blah blah.
That was in 1869. That was that was years after the war had already concluded.
But the Union side is illegal. The South side is illegal. You're going to fight over that. Basically, that's what happened. Of course, like, you're going to fight over, is it legal? Is it not? We'll find out when the war concludes, I guess.
Right,
the morality matters more to me.
Yeah, and I understand the morality matters more, and I think I could even probably agree with you in many cases. The morality matters, which is actually one of the reasons I would say the South was morally right. But the point being that even if we assume that the North conceived of themselves on a moral crusade to abolish slavery, which I don't think that they did, not en masse. Obviously, John Brown did, right? You had certain people that did. I don't think Lincoln was of that group, but even if
he was pragmatic, of course, but he definitely was, yeah.
But even if we assume that the North was on this moral crusade to abolish slavery, and so they viewed the South as having no moral right to secede and no moral right to resist abolition and emancipation, the South conceived themselves of having a legal right that was longstanding in the United States and with precedent set in things like the Declaration of Independence, which is why they appealed so often to them being like a new American Revolution. And the North to them was analogous to the British Empire. And so all of these legal reasons that, say America declared independence from England, illegal taxes, oppressive policies, those were all the reasons that the South conceived of themselves as having the legal precedents to secede.
Taxes they don't see as illegal, but oppressive policies such as.
So again, we talked about the tariffs earlier.
Yeah, but that was 1861. That was because the South seceded. That passed. They didn't have tariffs. They had low tariffs for basically 70 years up to that point.
No, that's not true, because the tariffs of abomination were also a thing.
Which tariffs of abomination? Which tariffs exactly?
So you have Henry Clay's The American Protectionism, 1824, tariffs of abomination, 38% tax on imported goods, 45% tax on raw materials. That tariff ravaged the Southern economy, and it displaced a lot of Southern planters and farmers, but that's kind of beyond the point. So South Carolina, in that displacement, they lost 56,000 whites to death or flight to other Southern states. Calhoun initiates the nullification crisis in South Carolina, and then you have the Compromise of 1833. The tariffs were lowered, and then both sides, whatever, right? They can all shake hands on the compromise. Polk gets elected.
Compromise.
Yeah, but so Polk gets elected, and then you have the Walker Tariff of 1846. Tariffs were lowered 25% across the board, and it guaranteed equal protection for raw material production and manufactured goods. The Low Tariff of 1857, which was 15% tax for all goods. Then you have from 1840 to 1857, the U.S. revenue went from 20 million to 80 million.
Oh,
and
yeah.
America had the lowest tax rates in the world at the time, whatever. But
exactly, yeah.
Yeah, but then the Republican Party forms in 1857, and then you have the Morrill Tariff, which we talked about earlier.
Yeah, but that didn't pass till 1861 after the South seceded.
But it was proposed in 1857, and that was the threat to secession comes at that time.
Yeah, but a lot of stuff is proposed and doesn't pass. It's that one wouldn't have passed if the South had stayed.
Right, but that's all hypothetical. Because the tariffs of abomination did pass.
Yeah, but also I should ask, like, for example, where's Henry Clay from?
Virginia, right?
Kentucky.
Oh, Kentucky. Okay.
So it's also a matter of the tariffs before. If you look at other countries in the world, pretty low. If you look at basically that surplus, essentially super low. Tariffs overall, taxes didn't really exist in the way we see them today. Sure. From what I recall, no property, income tax, etc. Like, yeah, these are minor issues, but it's not the major tyranny. Essentially, it's something that often was negotiated, proposed, and then basically ratified or fought against and successfully fought against. It depends on the situation. It's normal, I would say, for governments to have these sorts of things, essentially.
Yeah.
And in fact, many of the tariffs were proposed by Southerners as well.
Go ahead. Sorry, I mean.
Many of the tariffs were proposed by Southerners as well, like Clay, for example.
Yeah. So the first thing I'll mention about Kentucky didn't secede, and they had very strong pockets of Union support. They were a border state. They had some Southern support, some Northern support.
Oh, that's fair, but I would still consider it the South, to be honest. But fair enough, yeah. Especially with Clay at the time, but yeah.
Yeah, but so you keep on saying, like, well, what was going? It's low compared to what the world is doing.
Yeah,
that's fine and all, but that is not particularly relevant to the actual conversation where we're talking about the effect that it had on the North and the South, respectively. What the effect that tariff had on the North and South.
But you also mentioned the surplus as well.
So yeah, you're talking about when the American economy boomed from 20 to 80 million. Yeah.
Yeah.
But that was after the Jeffersonians came back into power. But
sure, but that's kind of the thing. You have politics. You can basically have your party come back into power and basically boom times. It's something that it's pretty normal in a democracy as far as it goes.
Sure. But as we start to see Western expansion happening and the South starts to see that they're losing ground in the federal government, and they start to see the federal government's no longer interested in serving both sides equally, why would the South hang around and try to fight the inevitable? Like, what's the point of that?
Well,
if the North is already screwing them over and the North is expanding, why would the South hang around for the inevitable to happen?
What's the inevitable?
Well, the inevitable would be they would be perpetually oppressed through policies such as the tariffs.
I would say perpetually oppressed with the abolition of slavery, to be honest with you. But I would basically say, as far as it goes, I do believe that these issues could have been solved democratically. In fact, I think it's almost a betrayal of the Union. Every single time a politician is elected who may be radical, maybe do something you don't like, you threaten secession. I don't think democracy can work that way. And in fact, if it does wind up being that way, it negates the entire American Revolution. And I think in that sense, it's heinous. It's why Lee was aghast about it initially, essentially. But even then,
but just for the record, Lee, I agree. Lee was aghast with the initial secession movement, but he did fight for Virginia, of course. And then later, the Jolly Six who founded the Klan, they initially went to Lee to ask him to be the head of the Invisible Empire. He had to decline for health reasons. He was the one that actually proposed force to become.
He wanted to put their arms down, essentially. He really didn't want insurrection either.
No, he actually. So he was the one that told them that they should maintain their status as this protective organization that used violence. He told them that, and then he was one that proposed Forrest to be what would become the Grand Wizard, named after Forrest.
I didn't
But
know about that, to be honest with you.
And Lee specifically said that he was going to support them from the shadows because he couldn't do it publicly due to his health and age, and also his status is, of course, getting involved with like Washington Lee University and starting to try to re-educate Southerners and whatnot. He had a kind of a public image to maintain, but he gave his full support to the violent protectionism of the Klan.
I didn't know about that. From what I'm aware of the public image of him basically saying, "Put down your weapons, let's rejoin the Union." That was his thoughts, from what I was aware of. I didn't know that about the Klan.
Yeah, it's very interesting. It's there's a book written by the daughter of one of the Jolly Six. It's called The Authentic History of the Klan by what's her name, Susan Lawrence Davis. It's a very good read.
But yep, as far as it goes, I would say the tariffs. To get back to it, essentially, you have that surplus. You have the fact that you have debate, democracy. Certainly, there's issues over tariffs, but again, in the threats of secession and declarations of secession, and Lincoln being elected, even fears of losing power. It all points to slavery, in my opinion. Multiple statements of slavery is the issue, slavery was the cause. Even in the North, you have Abraham Lincoln. I forget the author's name. Uncle Tom's Cabin. He invited, I think it's Mary something, to the Oval Office. You're the little lady who caused the Civil War. It all still points back to slavery, essentially. That's something that's continuously cited by both politicians and just in general. I would argue the populace, and that's more contentious. The populace has obviously different views, but people are willing to die for it in basically the Western states, bleeding Kansas. Biggest issue, in my opinion.
So the biggest issue with bleeding Kansas was not. So part of it was that the lines did break on, slave state versus free state.
Yeah.
But
and also, again, the tariffs. Don't forget Nebraska and the Midwest. Like, they weren't really in favor of it either. In fact, you could probably have had a Southern Midwest alliance because those states were pretty agrarian too.
Yeah. So who was where was the money coming from for the Free State movement in Kansas?
From what I'm aware of, abolitionists in the Northeast, New England.
Yeah. The Immigrant Aid Society was one of the big ones. So while it did somewhat break on that the slave state versus free state line, it also broke on. It broke regionally, where the South felt that they had sort of a natural right to Kansas, right, being a border state to Missouri. People would come from Missouri, they'd come up from Arkansas, they'd come up from the South, which made much more sense than, say, Bostonians importing themselves, or John Brown, right, coming over to Kansas for no real good reason. And the reason the Southerners, and there was, of course, a lot of illegal proceedings in the votes there and whatnot, but the Southerners conceived of that as a play to grab another state to gain some primacy in the federal government.
Okay, but let me ask you this one for Kansas. Which is more important, a state free from tariffs or a state that has slavery?
See, I reject this either or. I don't think that either of those is the answer. I think the answer is that having a state which would have supported the interest of the South at the federal level.
Slavery in this case, which has slavery basically. A slave state.
That was one of the lines that it broke on, but it also broke on like Democratic versus Republican lines, or what later becomes kind of the Republican Party. It broke on agrarianism versus industrialism, right? The Immigrant Aid Society came to Kansas to bring machines and industry there, and it upset and displaced the life that Southerners enjoyed.
Oh yeah, but why were people willing to die there? It wasn't for tariffs. It wasn't for industrialization. It was over slavery. They were willing to kill and die over slavery in Kansas.
No, so I would disagree here. In some cases, New Englanders were. John Brown obviously was.
Oh yeah.
But see, this is all right. So in the case of Kansas, you have people that are from Missouri that go to Kansas, they stake land legally, and then you have New Englanders that are flooding into the territory that are rigging elections, that are casting more votes than their people.
I agree. It was rigged. It was in fact,
Yeah,
it probably should have been a slave state, but
sure,
that's
but
the point. It's something where that's still slavery.
no, but yeah, but I'm making a different point here. So when you talk about like slavery was the reason that people were willing to fight and die, just because the North was willing to fight or die on the ground of slavery, that doesn't mean that the South was. Right? This is a very different situation when New Englanders, ideologically driven New Englanders, are coming from Boston to fight a war of abolition in Kansas versus Missourians are staking land and their futures in a neighboring state. And those people come here and start killing them. Right? The issue then for those Southerners becomes no longer, oh, well, we're fighting an ideological battle against for slavery. It becomes, you're in my land, fuck you, I'm going to kill you. Right? So this is kind of the thing we see across. This is one of the things that makes the war somewhat difficult to compare what the North was doing versus what the South was doing, because the North was fighting a war of offense. It was completely offensive. The South was fighting a defensive war. So even people, famously, like 90% of the Southern population didn't own slaves, but yet Yankees were still there walking through a yeoman's, 100-acre farm and threatening to kill him. And so it kind of, when the ideological war really only occurred on the northern side, the southern side, it was a war of defense, like get out of my land.
Oh yeah, but 90% didn't own slaves. I forget if that's the exact number, but regardless, they participated in the system. It was entrenched in the South. It's sort of like you don't have to own a factory to participate and to be a manager, to be an overseer, etc. But even past that, it's still over slavery. The North wants to fight to abolish slavery. The South, hey, we just want to mind our own business. To mind our own business with slaves. Why can't you let us be? Because we don't like slavery, essentially. In that regard, if it was an issue of they wanted to just basically be peaceful and chill and all that, I hate to sound so crass, but it could have been something like, hey, give up your slaves. Sounds good. Can we keep our land? Sure. That was the issue. They want slavery. The North doesn't want slavery. That's the fighting point.
Yeah, and that was why I brought up the Corn Amendment in my opening statement here, because we did see that. The North did try to concede that point and say, you can keep your slaves. We're going to protect them perpetually, forever. We
Except
can't even buy
Western
your
territories.
To the immediate cause of secession, that wasn't shouldn't have affected the immediate cause of secession, like what we're talking about here. If the immediate cause of secession was maintaining slavery, then it's like, hey, look, we're going to go ahead and keep slavery, this amendment. Then you would have expected to see the states at least press the brake pedal and say, okay, we'll come to the table and start talking about this.
Oh, they did. Not all the states seceded. In fact, many of the states initially were at the table. But then the two big issues are Western expansion, essentially, curbing slavery in the West, and then they didn't trust Lincoln.
Well, so Virginia had just as much interest in maintaining slavery as any of the other southern states did, and they ratified the amendment. And so this is kind of my point here, is like, we do see southern states ratify, and whatever arguments, can be made for Western territories or whatnot, those were able to be set aside for at least a time. And like I said, in the actual declarations of immediate causes for immediate secession, only 2 of those states even cited slavery as being a primary cause.
From what I recall, it was a bit more. And then you even have basically lots of people citing slavery, Confederate vice president. It's something that does pop up. But
so
I think it does go back. Yeah.
No, I have somewhat of a note on the topic of Stevens. Stevens was only vice president for a little bit.
Sure.
He had a falling out with Jeff Davis, and he was living in Georgia by the time of the war, and he had no contact with the Confederate government. He was completely disconnected from the Confederate government. And he was actually kind of the pseudo leader of a movement for Georgia to secede from the Confederate States over things like conscription. Conscription was a big one. He disagreed with conscription.
Oh, yeah.
But yeah, so Stevens, while he was vice president, he also wasn't that involved in the actual Confederate government, especially not by the end of the war.
To be fair, though, to be vice president, you have to be pretty significant in the country, to be frank. It's not just a random Yahoo. It's he was the former vice president.
Yes, he was. But what I'm saying, though, is like the fact that he broke away from that role and he had a falling out with the Confederate government, it
was popular at some point.
Yeah, but it casts doubt on the fact that he's a spokesperson for the Confederate States. I agree with you fully. He was a spokesperson for Georgia, and
But he
Georgia was one of
was.
those states that cited slavery.
Oh yeah, but he was popular enough at one point, essentially, to gain the rank of vice president. That's pretty quite significant. Yeah.
Well,
Oh,
it wasn't done by popular vote in the Confederate States.
oh,
It was the president Davis and Stevens were elected by politicians. But the point here being that it should cast doubt. The fact that he cites slavery, we're talking about the cause for secession of these southern states, not Georgia.
oh
So
yeah.
the fact that he cites slavery, he's not a spokesperson for the Confederate States the way that, say, Jefferson Davis was, who does not cite slavery and argues against the fact that slavery was the cause of secession.
But I think he argues more about the after, post-war, essentially, not during the war.
Davis?
During or prior. Yeah, from what I remember, there's a lot of basically a lot of stuff he wrote after the war, essentially. I don't recall him basically being vehemently, I guess, trying to create a narrative that this is not for slavery during the war. I'm not aware of that as far as I'm aware.
Well, he actually, Davis had massive. He was actually very not supported by the planter class, even though he himself was a planter from a very, he had a plantation. His family was a planting family.
Oh
They
yeah.
owned many slaves. He was somewhat unpopular among the planter class because he was so strict that, guys, look, we're fighting an existential conflict here. Your slaves don't matter, because what was happening was a lot of the individual planters. Richard Taylor talks about this in his Deconstruction of Reconstruction, where he was just absolutely shocked that these planters would send their sons to war, but they wouldn't loan their slaves to the effort to like dig trenches or something. And Davis criticizes the planters. He's like, you guys need to get off your high horse. Like, that's great. And all the, you guys don't want us to use your slaves, but this movement is not about slavery, and everybody needs to be involved with this because our independence and our existence is at stake here.
I remember him saying things like that, of course, after the war, but not during or prior to the war. That's my big issue. I think Jason says we have maybe a break in dialogue, I guess.
Yeah, well, yeah, we're at an hour, so
yeah.
We'll go ahead and cut it off here if you guys are good with that.
Yeah, that's fine.
So I'll remind the audience one more time. We got one question so far for the end. So I'll remind the audience one more time that if you got any questions for the debaters, put those in the live chat. We'll do closing statements next, and then we'll get to any questions at the end. We don't have that many people watching because we're small, but we got one question at least, so that's cool. So we'll go ahead and go into closing statements next. So we'll go in reverse order of the openers. So John will have the first one. So we'll do 5 minutes again. I'll start it when you start talking, and then I'll give you a heads up at 30 seconds left if you get that far, or you can just let me know if you're done sooner. Okay. So whenever you're ready, go ahead.
All right. Yeah. So I didn't write a closing statement for the debate. My overarching goal was to establish that slavery in the South, while it was a point of contention, and in many cases it was a talking point, the cause of secession go back much further than that, and they're much deeper rooted than that. And I don't have to prove that the tariffs or Western expansion were the cause of secession. I just have to prove that slavery was not the primary cause. And I think that I proved that, at least cast doubt on the fact that slavery was the primary cause, the way that modern academia wants us to believe it was. And we heard a lot about the moral issues that the North had with slavery. And I don't think that those moral issues are particularly relevant to the topic, which is ultimately whether the South, how they conceived of their own secession, not how the North conceived of their secession. So yeah, we do have people like, Lloyd Garrison of the Liberator magazine, the radical abolitionist in office during Reconstruction, even during the war, that viewed Southern secession as being a war for slavery, and they conceived of themselves as being abolitionists fighting against it. But that's irrelevant to how the South conceived of their own movement. And I think that the Southern writing during the war, before the war, and even during the Lost Cause era, none of it really highlights slavery as being the absolute cause of secession or even the primary cause, the grievances are far deeper rooted than that. And yeah, I think that's about it.
All right,
Well
you
said.
good? You still got a few minutes, so I just want to make sure you're good with that.
Yeah, I didn't write anything. I was just
All right.
kind of shooting from the hip there.
Cool. So one more reminder to the audience: drop your questions in the chat. Looks like we had one more during that closing statement. So yeah, any more of those, drop them in the chat. And after Nurgle's closing statement, we'll get to those. So same thing. You got 5 minutes. I'll let you know when you got 30 seconds left, and whenever you're ready, go for it.
I would say slavery. It's a big issue, essentially. There's other issues that are bit on the periphery, such as tariffs. I can't think of anything else besides that. You could argue about government overreach. I argue it's something that could be solved democratically. But in my view, the tariffs are at best a secondary issue, but I don't think they were the main issue. I'll close by quoting John Stuart Mill, the famous liberal philosopher. What are the Southern chiefs fighting about? Their apologists in England say that it is about tariffs and similar trumpery. They say nothing of the kind. They tell the world, and they told their own citizens when they wanted their votes, that the object of the fight was slavery. Many years ago, when General Jackson was president, South Carolina nearly did rebel. She was never near separated about a tariff, but no other states abetted her. It's important, no other states abetted her during that rebellion over a tariff or threat of secession. And a strong adverse demonstration from Virginia brought the matter to a close. Yet the tariff of that day was rigidly protective. Compared with that, the one in force at the time of secession was a free trade tariff. This later was a result of several successive modifications in the direction of freedom, and its principle was not protection from protection, but as much of it only as might incidentally result from duties imposed for revenue. Even the moral tariff, which never could have passed but for Southern secession, is stated by the high authority of Mr. H.C. Carey to be considered more liberal than the reformed French tariff. I'm not going to bore you with the rest of this, but basically, other individuals talk about tariffs essentially. It's not necessarily an appeal to authority, but tariffs are brought up from time to time. Most people saw it basically as something that was brought up after the war, was brought up by British propaganda because they also had an abolitionist movement and something not that serious. Even when South Carolina did threaten secession over tariffs, none of the other southern states really cared. They didn't really abet it. In fact, they kept South Carolina in line. The key difference here is slavery. They wanted to protect slavery, and Lincoln spooked them. That'd be my concluding statement, I would say.
All right, thank you for that. We'll go to thanks again. Thank you guys both for coming on to debate this. Like I said at the beginning, I think Nurgle, you're the first guy who's ever actually accepted a debate challenge from John on Substack. So thank you.
I don't know why. Honestly, debate's pretty fun and chill.
Well, I think most people just yap on notes and they don't actually want to talk about anything. So
yeah,
I'm dumb. So, I just save stuff from my memory, basically.
Yeah. So I we both appreciate you coming on.
Yeah.
And
sure.
I think I hope you'll agree that I was a fair moderator, even though I'm friends with John. Yeah, so we do have a couple questions from the audience. So I think these are both questions for both of you guys, so you guys can answer them in whatever order you want. American writer and essayist asks, what is your stance when it comes to state versus federal authority? And do you believe the states or federal government should be more influential? So you guys can both, I think that's for both of you guys. You can answer it in whatever order you want.
Do you want to go first, or do you want me to go first?
My answer is very short. I obviously think that the state should have primacy in the relationship between the federal and state government. The states were the ones that conceded certain rights, and the federal government cannot exist without the states having done that.
Well said. I'll agree and disagree in a sense. I'm usually pro states' rights. In fact, I actually think that we should have more states' rights currently than the federal government affords us. I think the federal government is gross. It's overreached. It's legal authority. I think it's basically a leviathan, a beast. I think you could argue that in some cases the federal government should be strong because we have enemies such as the Chinese. We have enemies across the world. I would rather have a stronger America than a weaker America. And there are cases where the federal government has justification, but by and large, I think I mentioned it earlier. I don't really care about the legality of certain arguments. I think morality is what wins the day, and I do believe that states' rights does tie in with that morality. I think as far as it goes, we all have the right to decide who represents us, what our liberties are and are not. I'm fully in support of states' rights. My big issue is I do see that the big states' right issue of the Civil War, in my opinion, was slavery, which I
Cool.
don't see as moral, basically. So that morality argument kind of gets null, basically.
Okay. And then our second question. This is the last one in there right now. If you guys got any last minute questions, feel free to put them in while they're answering this one. Mike George asks, why didn't the central government offer compensated emancipation the way Britain did? Again, I think that's for both of you guys, so you can answer it in whatever order you want.
You go first, Nergal.
They ought to have. They should have, to be frank. But I would say that as far as it goes, slavery was just so integral to the Southern system. Again, I think it's about $3 billion in terms of total revenue, even more than the railroads. Ending slavery basically destroyed the South. The South, I don't think really. I mean, obviously it did survive, but the thought was it couldn't survive without slavery. They'd be poor, they'd be paupers. Even if you basically bought out every slave. Two issues, I don't think it would have been as economically productive. In fact, the South largely wasn't for about 100 years. And on top of that, I think the South did have a fear of a servile insurrection or servile rebellion. Was the fear well founded? I don't think so. I think Reconstruction went well enough, but there was a big fear. So maybe the central government, the federal government should have offered that. But I think even if they did, the South wouldn't take it.
I think that the federal government, I think, obviously didn't offer compensated emancipation because they weren't interested in ending slavery until it became a necessary point to keep Europe out of the war. I do think that the South would have accepted compensated emancipation had it been extended over, say, maybe 20 years and given themselves time to absorb the impact that losing their slave labor would have caused. I don't think that it was an insurmountable obstacle. I think that they would have been able to be as economically productive, if not more economically productive, without the institution of slavery. And I think the federal government just didn't offer it because they weren't interested in abolishing it initially.
All right. Well, I'll finish off with one last question of my own. Imagine a situation where slavery just never happened in what became the United States. Like the colonies never started importing African slaves at all. We didn't have this problem. Everything else, the immigration from Britain and from the rest of Europe stays the same, but there are no slaves. There's no slavery in America. Do you think the Civil War still happens in that scenario?
I do. I think it does. And I'm not only saying that because I have to, obviously, to maintain my position. But I think it does happen, assuming that the immigration patterns remain the same, of course, and assuming that I don't think that one can live peacefully next to Puritans. I don't think that's an option.
Fair.
So if for them, I obviously admit that they had a moral crusade against slavery. But if it wasn't slavery for them, it would have been something else they would have had a moral crusade against.
Yeah.
I just don't think you can live peacefully next to Puritans, and I think it's very difficult to live peacefully next to people that aren't your own to begin with.
Yeah, I'll agree. I would say that slavery was the issue. Would there have been a different Civil War? Honestly, I think there might have been. I think the Civil War itself ended the issue of secession because if you look at the history, basically, there were always secessionist threats. 1812, New England threatens to secede over the War of 1812, war with England. I'm not going to get into that too much, but obviously it impacted their economy. There's secession threats in the 30s, 40s, 50s, individual states. What happens after the Civil War? There's no more secession threats. I think at some point there may have been other issues that may have popped up, not just with the South, but maybe with other states. Who knows? Maybe we could see a different future where I don't know. Without slaves, the South remains populous and they outvote the Northeast, and the Northeast tries to rebel and they fail. I think the Civil War basically ended the issue of secession, but without that, it was a pretty regular thing that popped up. Even as far as it goes, the Whiskey Rebellion, it's something where I would say we probably would have secession over some other issue. Who knows? If we didn't have it in the first 200 years, maybe it'd be over abortion, for all I know, right? But
Yeah.
saying that, for that to happen, you'd have to have basically a major regional issue. Taxes weren't really a regional issue. I'd even go back to Illinois, Nebraska, very agrarian at the time. What was a regional issue was slavery, and that happened to be the issue of the time.
All right. Well, let me check the chat one more time. Yeah, no more questions there. So I think that about wraps it up. So again, thanks both of you guys for coming on, and especially Nurgle, since you're not a regular part of this podcast. But
Anytime,
thanks for coming on.
yeah.
Thanks for coming on and being being a good sport and like being willing to come on and actually defend what you say in notes, which is pretty cool.
Yeah.
Like most people will not do that. I've found.
I've got mixed views, honestly. Like I think I opened up by saying the South was my favorite place. I love the South. So if you want to know more about me, basically, I always say I'm Creole. I am Creole. One of my ancestors was a famous pirate, for example, way back in the day. Was he a good person? I think he was pretty cool, to be honest. But saying that, what he did wasn't really good.
Yeah, many
I don't
such
really,
cases, honestly.
yeah, like I don't see the issue of slavery as a good one. I see it as morally questionable. I think it's bad. I think it's an evil. But saying that, there were a lot of good people who fought for a cause that I don't think was right. I think the cause was evil, but you still have heroism. You still have decent people. If you get back to Reconstruction, it's also partially why we do respect certain heroes like Lee. When Charlottesville happened, I'm going to get canceled, but saying that, there were respectable people in the South that I think we kind of did demonize in ways that were a bit excessive. But all in all, I just do fundamentally see slavery as the big issue, essentially. I do find it to be a morally corruptible cause to fight for. And in that regard, while I do love the South, I think the South made a terrible mistake in that case.
Yeah.
All right. Well,
Yeah,
I mean, John,
else.
you got any closing thoughts? I know we just I want to be fair, like give everybody
Yeah.
the same opportunity to talk. So if you got any last things to say, go for it.
No, I think that's a good place to close it. Perhaps one day, if you're interested in Nurgle, we could do a conversation on the morality of slavery. Because
Oh, yeah, sure,
I
absolutely.
do argue that slavery is a moral good.
No, I don't think so. But like, I would love to talk about, like, I don't know, the Haitian Revolution, slavery as a whole. Yeah, sure, anytime you want, honestly.
Cool.
That would be a cool debate. Honestly, I would like to see that because I'm not supposed to do this as the moderator, I guess, but I mean, I'm also on the southern side of the Civil War,
Yeah.
as far as my opinions go. But like, I actually used to think that slavery was, a moral bad or a moral evil, and that the South was not primarily fighting for that. But then John hasn't. I don't know if that was this on your old Substack that you had before you deleted it. You had an article of like laying out how slavery could actually be a moral good, and I was like, oh, that's interesting. I don't know if I'm completely convinced, but it was.
It can be.
It prompted some thought for me, at least.
It can be. Like, I would say chattel slavery. I don't think so. But then you have to get to the definition of slavery. I know we talked about wage slavery, chattel slavery, the Roman conception, the Greek conception. But my view basically is, I do believe in the liberty of man, and I think. Oh, maybe we should debate that another time, to be honest. But
yeah, that'd be a good topic for another debate, for sure.
Yeah. It's complicated, but I would say the slavery we have in the Americas, I don't see it as morally good. I think that my big fear there is less about slavery. I think it's a bad thing, more about how do we get rid of slavery, how do we prevent it? Because there's ways to basically go about it. For example, the compensation. and there's ways not to go about it. The Haitian Revolution, which turned into a bloodbath.
Yeah.
But I don't see it as good. I see it as basically, if you have slavery, you've got to phase it out. Basically, I think that there's many more benefits outside of slavery for humanity, basically. And then there's the economic stuff. I mean, like I think I mentioned immigrants. Oh my God, we can't compete in the Western territories because you have slave labor, so we need to have more free labor. I know it's like 20 cents a day versus free, but it's like it's something that I just see as basically corrupting an economy as well.
Yeah.
We'll be in touch, and maybe we can set
Sure.
that up as a future debate. That'd be interesting.
Anytime, honestly.
So yeah, again, thanks for coming on. We'll go ahead and end the stream here, and
Thank you both.
yeah, thanks for a good conversation.
Yeah, thanks, man.
Yeah, anytime. Yeah, you too. Peace, guys.
Later.
Peace.